I showed this Blue Chalcedony cabochon to my wife, and she wants me to make a pendant out of it. So I'm going to do something that is see-through so that you can see not only the color, but the translucency. So here's this piece of Blue Chalcedony that is very translucent, and now I want to make a setting for it, but I want the setting to be see-through, kind of like one I showed in a setting earlier, where I want the back of it to be open so you can see through the stone and see light and stuff like that through it. Well, there's a couple options I can do. I can use what's called a step bezel, and hopefully this will focus, where you see there's a ridge on the bottom of this piece of wire. However, the bezel itself isn't tall enough to cover the top of the stone because this is a reasonably thick stone. So I'm basically going to build my own, because I don't want to use this style where I make a solid back and then cut it out. Instead, I'm going to use square wire and make it the same size and shape as the cabochon, and then I'm going to solder a standard piece of bezel wire to the outside of that, so that it will cover the stone well enough to hold it in place. So I'm going to try and go through that process and take you along on this journey with me. So I'm going to start by getting a rough size I need by wrapping the square wire around the stone, but actually I'm going to cut it shorter so that it is the exact same size as the stone. So the stone will actually sit on top of the square wire, like more like that. So I'm going to cut it off here, and then I can start manipulating it, because this is a huge chunk of wire. So I need to get it more reasonable to work with. Okay, I haven't soldered it yet, but as you can see, the oval is almost identical to the cabochon. So now I'm going to go ahead and solder it up, and then that'll also anneal the material so I can manipulate it a little better, and then I'll get it closer to the oval shape, and then from there I will put some bezel wire around that and solder the bezel wire to this oval. Okay, I've got the solder joint made and cleaned up. Now I need to get the bezel wire and wrap around this, not the stone, so that the stone will set down into the step bezel when I'm done. Okay, I've trimmed the bezel wire down, but it's still slightly oversized. But that leaves me room for filing, because I have to make this joint perfect so that I can solder it together before I solder it to the oval and make the giant step bezel. You'll see, hang with me. Okay, so let's see if I can solder this joint and not melt down the bezel wire. Well, that looks pretty good. Let's cool it off in the water and test it right away. Good and solid. Okay, on to the next step. Now hopefully we can slip a square wired oval down inside the bezel wire. Kind of hard to do with one hand. And the stone will actually sit on top of the square wire. And I'm going to solder the back all the way around so that I have basically a big giant cup for the stone. So that's the theory anyway. Let's get this soldered together and see what happens. Well, I just thought before I solder this, I should do a test fit with the stone and see how that works. And that sets in there just nicely. It still leaves me a little bit to go around and bend over the top. Not a lot, but I think it'll be okay. So that's good. And because none of it's soldered together and it's a hole in the back, I can pop the stone out pretty easily. So let's get these two soldered together, and then that'll be good for today. Alright, I got this soldered together. So basically I've made a giant step bezel. You can see the seam is right here, but I've got it sanded down so you can't actually see the seam. There's a little tiny spot, but that's okay. That'll clean up. So now I need to create a bail, and I'm going to do a pretty simple bail. Just take some wire or plate, whatever you want to call it. Like here's a little piece that'll work just fine, and bend it over and make a loop out of it so that and then solder it together so that I can have a bail ready to go. Alright, that piece was a bit too wide, so I trimmed it down a little thinner. Now I'm just going to bend it over and create a loop with a little bit of an overlap. So I've got kind of a elongated pear shape. I'm going to solder the joint together and then cut it off so that it'll look something like that. And of course this will be gone. So let's see if I can get that soldered together and then trimmed up. Okay, so the solder is actually inside behind the bend of the metal or the joint of the metal, because as it melts I want to draw it through into the joint. And I believe it went. Well, this is kind of hard to see, but I've placed the bezel cup onto the bail, and then I marked where I want to cut it so that when I solder this together, you won't see this long tab hanging down. That'll be gone. So let's get that trimmed up and see what it looks like. Okay, it'll be something like that. It's obviously not soldered together. I have to clean this up a bit. There's a bunch of junk on there, and I want to reshape it a little bit better. Bring it down more to a point instead of just this flat thing. So I'm going to get that reshaped, and then we'll solder this all together. And then for the most part, we should be done with all the soldering, assuming I get it straight. And then we can start cleaning it up and getting ready to polish and set the stone. So this is a bit challenging, but what I'm trying to do is put pressure on this end so that I get a tapered, come on, focus. I get a tapered piece when I'm done. That's the theory anyway. But I need both hands to do it, so basically something like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is melt some solder onto the bale, hopefully. Now that I have a layer of solder on the bale, I will set the bezel cup on there and solder it again, and it should all adhere together. Alright, let's see if I can do this now. I have to use a bigger torch because I have pieces with larger mass. And hopefully this will all go without actually melting down the bezel wire. I think it's melting. Alright, let's see if it actually did. Yeah, I think it did. Now let's put it into the pickle and let it sit for a while, and then we'll come and check it out. Okay, so I've got the bale on, got it trimmed out so there's no points sticking down, and now I just got to start sanding everything, get it smooth and ready to take over to the buffing wheel. Alright, this silver's polished. Now I gotta set the stone. Unfortunately, I need both hands, so you won't be able to see that. Alright, let's peel the cover off here and see how we did. Looks good that way, and it looks good that way. So a nice simple setting. Emphasize the stone and not the silver. Hopefully she'll like it.